And I will say Final Fantasy 13, and particularly, right, that emphasis on Lightning Returns and on the individual, even the
Yeah.
story of Final Fantasy 13, right, is kind of focused around a central character and their relationship to either their party members, but also, right, to a, say, missing figure in their life.
Yeah.
What is also incredibly like interesting is that that story that I just talked about is an individual, right, supported by their followers, and then about a missing figure in their life is very much the story of Final Fantasy 15.
Yeah.
Right now, a lot of you a lot of you people that are in my generation and above remember that Final Fantasy 13 was also supposed to have Final Fantasy 13 verses where Noxus was going to feature instead of Final Fantasy 15, and that game was not actually in really development at all. And alas, for you Gen Zers out there, yeah, Final Fantasy 15 was not supposed to exist. Noxus was supposed to be this kind of foil to Lightning,
Yeah.
right? And I think seeing that, and I hope hearing that, if you have played 13, you've played Lightning Returns, right? Particularly as well as Final Fantasy 15, you then also see a future, right? Kind of where that focus on the story of the individual, right, is starting to meet the mechanics of that individual. And
Yeah.
I think that's really what, if we kind of actually draw a thoroughfare to what I believe the Final Fantasy kind of genre, or the epochs, if you will, is that they always have an emphasis on that storytelling. And it's a very much bespoke, authored experience that even in their open world games, or well, I was going to say open world games, but MMOs are not quite an open world. That's a different genre. But in the
Yeah.
open world of Final Fantasy 15, immediately, right, it shut you off at chapter 8 and it goes back to its linear formula. And I think that that's important to note. I think it's just interesting, right? We have to have the story alongside, for me at least. And this isn't coming because I'm a narrative designer. This is coming from a purely practical standpoint that if you're going to focus on an individual's story, you need to give more time, right, in gameplay towards that individual as well.
Exactly. And you see this, and it's really interesting if you compare the Final Fantasy VII remake to the original Final Fantasy VII, because you can actually see how this has happened in the comparison between those two games. Because even when you're like Cloud is not in your party, the way in which the game is structured is that you still have one of the characters who happens to be in your party, be it like Aerith or Tifa or whatever, like they are still the center of what is going on. And so not only are they the center of gameplay, in other words, you're controlling them directly in combat encounters, they're also the narrative focus. They are the perspective through which events are being seen in that particular moment. And this is especially important for a character like Aerith, who, frankly, in the original Final Fantasy VII, is not a terribly well developed character, if I'm being perfectly honest. Whereas she has much more, well, very literal agency, because she's literally doing things of her own volition, rather than as kind of like a hanger on in like Cloud's band of merry misfits.
So actually, I while I could dig into the Aerith problem, I think in a whole other episode, and maybe
Yeah.
we should dive into that. I think what Nicholas is getting at in Final Fantasy VII Remake's storytelling, right, is that Aerith originally is more of just like a secondary kind of party figure in the original Final Fantasy VII. It is much a journey and a story about Cloud that just happens to have tactics of a party,
Yeah.
right? And it is Tifa, right, or Aerith. They get the same kind of scene and they, right, swap the static meshes.
Yep.
You can outfit them in either way. Aerith is more of a healer, right? And Tifa is not. So I think that a lot of, right, the Final Fantasy VII originally kind of came from, right, the fact that they killed, right, Aerith halfway through the game. And it was kind of one of the
Yeah.
first times that, right, a party member, and they took your items, right? Like it's gone.
Oh yeah.
So, like, it was like a huge, right, gameplay moment. Even if you didn't really kind of value the character, you begin to value them more because of this permadeath mechanic.
Yeah.
But what I think is really kind of relevant here is that in Final Fantasy VII R, or Final Fantasy VII Remake, the story of Aerith has changed slightly.
Yeah.
And that's all I really or I want to say. But
Yeah,
I
I'm not
think
going to
the
spoil that. It's weird.
agency of, and so that's what we talk about when we say agency, is it's not just the player's agency playing her, it's the agency of the character and the way that character is being portrayed to, right, the user or to the player.
Yeah.
Um I do want to step back though,
Okay.
because Final Fantasy VII R is released after Final Fantasy 15.
That is true, and in many ways improves upon a lot of 15's what I would call concerns. 'Cause the thing is, like, so actually there's a lot of the, like, DNA of 15 in 16, especially when it comes to the combat mechanics. Like, for example, the warp strike mechanic that you have in 15 is very similar to what is it called? Phoenix Strike? Did I
Yep,
get that
it's
right?
Phoenix Strike.
Yeah, in 16, although in 16 the Phoenix Strike is more like a basic charge, whereas the Warp Strike is a little bit more, in fact, it's actually a lot more complicated in 15, because one of the major issues with the combat mechanics in 15 is that it's very confused and very muddled. You have, and this is a point that I made to Lauren a couple of weeks ago, that it's like there are several complete ideas of how like combat is supposed to work in 15, and they all kind of get mushed together even when they directly contradict each other. So like for example, the warp strike mechanic in 15, the way it works is that the further away you are when you warp in, the more damage you do when you hit for the first time. So this encourages a kind of combat where you're moving in and out as your other, like, party members, as your companions are also fighting, whatever creatures or boss or whatever happens to be. But the problem with this is that the other mechanics, like the link strikes with your companions, and also the positionals on the various like creatures and bosses, like that actually emphasizes being much more like in the thick of things and sort of staying close to your companions, not constantly zipping in and out. So there's this inherent contradiction. Whereas what 16 has done, I think, and also 7 did this as well. 7 took it in one direction, sorry, 7R, and 16 took it in another, is that it cleaned up that muddied sense of combat mechanics in 15. However, that having been said, in order to understand either of them, you really do have to look at 15, because there is the germ of a really, actually several really good ideas there. That's all I wanted to say.
No, I think that's an incredibly good thing and a good like kind of preview into what I want to talk about that deep dive in that transitional period in our Patreon episode. And like for me, something that like you have to understand too is that we're talking about Final Fantasy 13 and Final Fantasy right 13 2, which was released in I think 2009 and 2011 respectively.
Yeah.
But Final Fantasy 13 Lightning Returns is released in 2013. And for those of you who are Final Fantasy 14 fans, A Realm Reborn is also released in the year 2013.
Yep.
Right? Final Fantasy 15, 3 years later, is released in 2016. Right? Kingdom Hearts 3, I knew that we were going to come back to it. You knew we were coming back to it. Is released
Yeah.
in 2019, but was originally slated to release in 2017. It was pushed back many years, particularly because of Unreal Engine becoming free in 2015.
Yeah.
And so that really propelled the Kingdom Hearts right forward. They switched their development engine halfway through the project
Yeah.
in 2015, right? Obviously, they needed at least 4 more years to try to clean it up and port everybody over. They
Yeah.
probably needed more in it, but Kingdom Hearts 3 had been development for 10 years at that time. The Final Fantasy VII Remake was released in 2020.
Yep.
And now, 3 years later, we have Final Fantasy 16. So
Yeah.
these dates are incredibly important. And the reason why this evolution is so important is that if you have been playing Final Fantasy games for, I was going to say 10 years, but Lauren, Final Fantasy 2005 is to. Anyway, if you've been playing Final Fantasy games for your life
Yeah.
out there,
Me
but
too. I mean, I just go further back, so
you just go further back,
yeah.
right? If you've been playing Final Fantasy games that long, like, and I've been playing it from before, I don't know, the first date was 2005, I think. Like, that's what I'm saying. If you've been playing Final Fantasy games for 20 years, there is a very clear evolution between, right? And now let's get back to today's episode talking about Final Fantasy 16, a clear evolution, not only in the combat mechanics, right? And the party dynamics from
Yeah.
Final Fantasy 15 or Final Fantasy 7R, which is much more a kind of focused combat, but also a lot of design from level design, their story design, encounter design, how the actual bosses play out come a lot from Final Fantasy 14. I
Yeah.
mean, it's very much, but the mission and dungeon design that kind of is on top of the overlaid of
Yeah,
the
yeah.
both the open world and the linear missions of Final Fantasy 16, man, it's such an evolution literally of every single game. It's just an iterative formula, and it's that iteration of Final Fantasy that I think gives them such staying power because it's actually not so different